gentlemen in the studio in Lagos and Abuja to help us understand what the situation is from the legal side. Mr. Jiti Ogunye joins us. Thank you for coming.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for inviting me.
And from the financial sector side, two gentlemen, one of them, Akin Oyebode, economist and development banker. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us from our Abuja studio is Ugo Okorafor, special advisor to the CBN governor on communications. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right, before we come to you, let me begin with Mr. Ogunye. What's your view of the debt situation in Nigeria?
Well, the fact that debt exists in name and in fact signifies that individuals and entities, including government, can owe debts, meaning that they can raise credit. It's a way of life. Right from antiquity, people had reasons or causes to borrow from their neighbors in order to go on living. So I'm not going to come here this morning to say that, no, in all situations, we shouldn't have debt. From a legal perspective, there are laws that govern how you can borrow money. What rankles, however, is that it's now almost becoming a culture that our governments perennially go to borrow money, go to capital market, state governments, they raise bonds, and so on and so forth. The fixation people had before was that individuals, corporate entities in the private sector, that was their pastime, not government that generate taxes, that have other sources of generating revenue, will be in a dire situation as to sustain its operations basically on the basis of debt. Because the argument has been made, yes, you can borrow money, but what are you using the money for? When you borrow money to pay salaries, as indeed we've been told, the federal government level and the state level. So how sustainable can that be? I think that that's the big issue, because moving forward, is this sustainable? What will happen in the next 1 year, 2 years, 15 years, and so on and so forth? If we just want to get by, I've been elected for 4 years. I don't care what happens in 20 years. Let me just go borrow money, do anything, pay salary, not offensive servants. So I won't be thrown out. So I won't have bad press and all that. If that's what you want to do, okay. But if we really want to salvage this country, we have to do something. And visualize or envisage a situation whereby in 20 years, you won't have this oil money anyway. Maybe because of the advance in energy sector globally, or because something will have given. So how are you going to survive? An anchor, how are you going to survive on a long term? How are you going to ensure that either by default or otherwise, a country that started off as 4 regions, having 4 administrative centers, later becoming 12 states, later becoming 19 states, now become 36 states, and they keep creating bureaucracies and all that all over the place. So are you going to sustain this kind of thing in the long term? That's what I'm interested in.
Mr. Oyebode, he said Nigeria is becoming a perennial borrower. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I think I'd rather deflect whether you're a perennial borrower or not. I think that might mask the real conversation. So there are a number of things he's also touched on that are very valid. So one is, how do you utilize the capital you've raised, right? So do you use this to fund consumption? Do you use it to fund production? Do you use it to improve security? You know, so it depends on, so utilization is a critical part. And I think that's a part that we sometimes overlook. So there are all sorts of there's all sorts of information available. So when sub-sovereign, when states go to raise money, there's a prospectus, right? So how well do we, how critically do we look at these things? Is it right to go to the capital markets, get money at 14, 15% to build schools? One might argue that educating the next generation is a function of the state as well. But remember that those schools you build are actually cost centers, because you're then going to have to pay teachers, you're going to have to renovate the schools. In some cases, you might have to feed the children, and there's no way that instrument is being repaid from the activity it is being used to finance. So you've got to find somewhere else to repay. So that's the first problem. I think, again, if you look at the sovereign, there are two ratios people would typically look at. So if you look at debt to GDP, which sort of speaks to the economy's capacity to absorb such debt, Nigeria is not doing badly at all. I mean, we have...
Nigeria is not doing badly, but the fear amongst Nigerians...
I'm coming. So you've got a fairly healthy debt to GDP ratio, better than most of your peers. But that's, again, because it's one of the challenges with a rebasement of the economy, is that it, in practice, gives you an allowance to borrow more, right, if you want to use those numbers to make a case. But what is more important is your repayment ability. And yes, we understand that, in theory, the sovereign can default, right? But it shows that if you are spending over 20% of your revenues on debt service, it's a pretty difficult situation to be in. And that's, I mean, those don't even talk about some of the other obligations you might have. So you've spoken about contractor payments, you've spoken about salary arrears, you have some infrastructure needs, you have to spend some money to secure the country. So I think that we're in a difficult position, no doubt about that. But I think Mr. Ogunye makes a very valid point around the sustainability of having 36 states and duplicity of administrative processes. And so, I mean, if I take my state, for example, I'm from Ekiti. That state used to be Ondo State, right? But today you have two governments sitting out of that place. And who knows, someone from Ilaje might say, hey, we want our own state in 5 years, right? And then you have a third state, and so those things duplicate resources. And if you look at even the ability of our government to take difficult decisions, we've been having an ongoing debate, should subsidies be removed, yes or no? In terms of civil service, for example, people say at state level there's lots of ghost workers. Should workers be verified? Kaduna State has taken the lead in that regard. I expect some of the other states who are struggling with paying salaries to look at this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take some difficult decisions that help them become more fiscally responsible.
Okay. The ordinary Nigerian is watching now and is saying, okay, why should Nigeria go borrowing? We have the resources in this country.
That's a misnomer. You see, so the thing is, we keep saying we have the resources. I think it's a bit of a misnomer. So you have a country where 75% of your revenues come from crude oil, right? And you have crude prices being suppressed by a number of reasons, right? So some advancements in technology. In some cases, there's a supply glut, right?
Okay. Let me just butt in here and bring in the CBN man, so that let's have an overview. They are managing the nation's debt profile, and basically, Mr. Okorafor, tell us, are we a perennial borrower? Are we in such dire straits as in there is no hope, or is the weight too much for the taxpayers to carry? Because that's where we're looking to now, since we have the dwindling oil prices.
Well, thank you very much. The point you're making, I wouldn't like to use the expression perennial borrower. Every nation borrows, and I don't think we have a debt overhang that is unmanageable. Gentlemen in the street said, you need to be efficient to you manage the loans or the assets that you create through borrowing. What we have found out is that there is a very low level of efficiency in the management of these assets. The investment doesn't go properly into, let me start by saying that by its nature, the public sector is an inefficient utilizer of resources because of the nature of the public sector. So you have to be very careful when you run up debts, especially debts that go into wasting assets, not the ones that go into the creation of infrastructure. So the point that is being made is we need to borrow to create infrastructure that will then yield employment. Once you do it along that line, find out that it will be in the interest of the country to borrow, because there is no country that can develop at the pace it wants to, especially an emerging market like ours. We cannot develop without borrowing, but then we have to be very efficient in the way we borrow. Also, there's the private sector dimension, and then the state government. These are all debts that are run up, which we need to look at and take them into consideration. For the states, we found out that it's comfortable, the level of debts that they amass. And the central bank has tried to put a cap on that, working with DMO and the fiscal authorities to make sure that we create a proper environment so that the instruments that are created and the bonds and all that will be viable, and that they can be quoted and when the time of payment comes, those states also will be able to repay.
Okay, you said something about the ability to pay back. Mr. Ogunye, when he was talking, talked about the duplicity of states, so to speak, a situation where we have 36 states. He talked about the sustainability. As the nation's banker, so to speak, don't you owe the nation that responsibility of advice in terms of we need to cut here, we need to cut there, we need to reduce this? Is that something that can be done?
Well, you use the word advice. Our job is to advise, and when we advise, we expect the authorities to do what is right along that line. But you know, there are statutory impediments. If, for instance, you have 36 state governments and 774 local governments, there's absolutely no way you will then say that the central bank, from its monetary policy position, can influence how money goes to those entities. They must be given money through allocation. And unless we are saying we are going to cut down on those structures, there are so many structural issues that we must face, which are totally outside the control of the central bank. So what we do is we'll point this out. I remember clearly that some years back, the central bank governor had warned that we needed to cut down on public expenditure. And everybody knows that much of what we spend in the public sector goes to recurrent expenditure. We spend less than 30% on capital expenditure, which is really what you need to spend money on in order to generate employment. Now, if you don't mind, I'll have to say that we have come to that point where it is very clear to everybody that the public sector can no longer power an economy that has 170 million mouths to feed. We need to give a lot of leeway, scope to the private sector. And that's why the central bank governor recently came out with the proposal that, listen, the things that we produce in this country, we do not need to expend foreign exchange bringing them in. And I think that's a move by Governor Emefiele that has been widely accepted, and we expect that it will help boost the local economy, generate employment and all that.
Okay, now let's, you've identified the fact that there's low efficiency in the management of resources. And where exactly is this inefficiency coming from? Is it from the central bank? Is it from the departments and agencies? Where exactly is this inefficiency coming from?
Well, when you talk about inefficiency, I said the public sector by its very